The reality of this shocking story begins, and we see James and Catalina Hope seemed like the perfect couple. Their children, Amaya and Cameron, were beloved by everyone in their quiet suburban town. But one Christmas Eve, their lives ended in a brutal massacre, and the truth behind their deaths would uncover a web of secrecies and betrayal no one could have predicted. Was it revenge, a financial scheme gone wrong, or something even darker? It was a crisp Christmas Eve in 2020 when the Hope family of Hillsborough, California, settled into what should have been a peaceful night. The town, known for its tree-lined streets and neatly kept homes, had always seemed like a sanctuary of place, where families gathered, children played, and neighbors looked out for each other. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. Especially at Christmas time, James Hope, a 45-year-old father, had been busy all day preparing for the evening's festivities. His wife Lois in the kitchen finishing up their holiday meal. Their two children, Amaya 17 and Cameron 16, had spent the afternoon wrapping presents and watching Christmas movies. The house was filled with the warmth of the season, the smell of roasting turkey, the flickering glow of the fireplace, and the laughter of a family that had much to be thankful for. On the surface, the Hopes were an ordinary family. James worked as a mid-level manager for a local tech firm, while Catalina, a stay-at-home mom, dedicated her time to the kids and community volunteer work. They were well-liked in the neighborhood, often attending block parties and organizing charity events. Noon could remember the last time the Hopes had been involved in any kind of controversy or drama. They were the kind of family everyone envied, with a picture-perfect life that seemed impossible to tear apart. But behind closed doors, things were not as idyllic as they appeared. James had recently taken on a new job, this tech company, one that involved greater responsibilities and a level of stress that was starting to show Catalina, ever the supportive wife, had noticed her husband's mood shift in the weeks leading up to Christmas. He had become distant, often working late into the night, his mind preoccupied with something that Catalina couldn't quite place. She brushed off her concern, telling herself that it was just the pressure of a new job. But there were moments when she wondered if something darker was lurking just beneath the surface. That evening, as the family sat down to dinner, everything seemed normal, almost too normal. The conversation was light, focused on upcoming holiday plans and their dreams for the new year. Amaya and Cameron exchanged teasing remarks, while Catalina and James shared a quiet smile. But beneath the calm, there was an unsettling tension. James's eyes occasionally darted to his phone as if he were waiting for a message, but he would quickly put it down and try to focus on his family. Catalina noticed, but chose not to comment. She didn't want to ruin the rare moments of peace they'd. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, James and Catalina stayed up talking in the living room. Catalina couldn't help but feel the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. She had asked James if everything was all right more than once, but he always brushed her off, claiming he was just tired. Little did she know this would be the last conversation they would ever have. The night wore on, and as midnight approached, the house fell silent. The holiday lights twinkled softly in the windows, casting a gentle glow on the quiet suburban street outside. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The Hopes' lives were about to be shattered in the most unimaginable way. The morning after Christmas Eve, the sun rose with an unusually bright glow, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban streets of Hillsborough. The town was still asleep, with most of its residents recovering from the festivities of the previous night. But the tranquility was about to be shattered. Mrs. Noah, the Hope's neighbor, had been trying to reach Catalina all morning. She had called several times to wish the family a Merry Christmas, but the phone went unanswered. This wasn't like the Hopes. They were always so responsive, always a part of the neighborhood's holiday cheer. Mrs. Noah brushed off her growing concern, thinking the family might just be sleeping in after a long night. But as the hours passed, she began to feel a sense of unease creeping in. By mid-morning, she couldn't ignore the gnaw and worry any longer. She decided to check on them. Mrs. Noah had known the Hopes for years, and they had always been kind to her, offering help when she needed it, and inviting her to family gatherings. She walked down the street, her thoughts heavy with suspicion, and approached their front door. The house looked just as it always had, neatly maintained, with wreaths hanging on the windows and a fresh layer of snow on the front steps. But something felt wrong. The front door was slightly ajar, which seemed odd. The Hopes were always meticulous about locking up before going to bed. Mrs. Noah hesitated for a moment, her heart racing before pushing the door open and stepping inside. The silence hit her like a wave. The house was eerily still, the only sound coming from the faint hum of their refrigerator. Mrs. Noah called out, but there was no response as she moved further into the hallway. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She rounded the corner into the living room and froze. There, sprawled on the floor, was James Hope. His body was face down, blood staining the carpet beneath him. Mrs. Noah screamed in horror, her voice barely above a whisper as she backed away from the gruesome sight. Panic set in. She rushed to the phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands, her voice trembling as she gave the operator her address and explained the situation. Within minutes, the police arrived and the house was swarming with officers. As they secured the scene, the horror only deepened. Catalina Hope was found in the kitchen, her body lying on the counter, lifeless and bloodied. Amaya and Cameron were discovered in their bedrooms, both showing signs of struggle. It was clear that they had fought for their lives, but ultimately, they had all succumbed to the same brutal fate. The police were stunned. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no sign of a robbery. The family's valuables, money, electronics, jewelry were untouched. Nothing had been stolen. Whoever had committed this horrific act had come into the house without any apparent intention to take anything. The scene didn't suggest a robbery gone wrong or even a random act of violence. It felt deeply personal, like the killer knew the victim. Swell Detective Markson and his partner, Detective Rivera, arrived shortly after. The initial response quickly taking control of the investigation. They began to piece together the timeline, but everything seemed to lead to more questions. Why had this family been targeted? What had prompted such brutal violence, especially during what should have been a time of peace? The neighborhood, once serene, was now flooded with suspicion and fear. Everyone wondered who could have done such a thing, and why. As the investigation unfolded, the detectives discovered something chilling. There had been no signs of a struggle outside the family. The killer, or killers, had been able to enter and exit the house without drawing attention. It was as though they had been expected, welcomed even into the home. The investigation into the Hope family's massacre took a darker turn, as Detective Markson and Detective Rivera delved deeper into the details of their lives. At first glance, the Hopes seemed like an average suburban family, with no enemies, no signs of danger lurking nearby. Their neighbors spoke highly of them. James was known as a quiet but dependable man. Catalina was warm and involved in the community, and their children were popular at school, always friendly and respectful. It made no sense. The detectives began their questioning with the people closest to the family, neighbors, friends, and anyone who might have had any interaction with them in the weeks leading up to their deaths. Nothing unusual stood out. There were no threats, no confrontations. No one had heard anything strange, and none of the neighbors had seen anything out of the ordinary on Christmas Eve. The house was dark, as it would be for most families on Christmas night, but nothing suggested that anyone had been hiding or sneaking around. Yet the police were convinced that the massacre was not random. The nature of the killings, the cold deficiency, and the utter lack of remorse or struggle pointed to a more personal connection. Whoever had committed the murders had likely known the family, but who? The investigation turned inward, focusing on James's work life and personal relationships. James's job at a local tech company, which he had recently joined after years of working in a smaller firm, became the first lead. He had worked for the company for only a short time, but his colleagues spoke of him with respect. However, the detectives quickly discovered a potentially crucial piece of information. James had been involved in a tense legal dispute with a former colleague, a man named Tom Harris. Tom had been fired from the company under mysterious circumstance, his career destroyed by accusations of financial misconduct. The case had caused a scandal within the company, and James had been one of the key witnesses during the internal investigation. He had corroborated the accusations against Tom, which many suspected had led to Tom's professional downfall. The detectives learned that after his dismissal, Tom had disappeared from public view, no longer showing up at work or social gatherings. Some said he had moved away, while others whispered that he was shutting in shame. The police tried to track him down, but it was like he had vanished off the face of the earth. As the investigation deepened, more unsettling details emerged. James had seemed to be preoccupied with Tom in the weeks leading up to the murders. A few colleagues remembered him mentioning Tom's name in passing, always with a note of concern, but no one had thought much of it. The tension had never been openly discussed. Had James feared that Tom might be seeking revenge, and if so, why hadn't he mentioned anything? To his family, a search of James's personal belongings at home turned up a stack of old emails, some dating back to the months before his death. The messages between James and his boss contained nothing that pointed to any immediate danger, but buried in the correspondence was one cryptic email from an unknown sender. It was an anonymous tip about Tom Harris, an email that was oddly worded, implying that Tom wasn't just angry at James for testifying against him. The tone hinted at something far more sinister. Suggesting that Tom had been planning something drastic for some time, the police began to connect the dots. The Hopes might have been caught in the crossfire of a much larger vendetta. The massacre was starting to look like an act of revenge, but the question remained, was Tom Harris the killer, or was someone else using him? As a scapegoat. The investigation had only just begun, and the detectives were beginning to feel the weight of the mystery grow heavier with each passing hour. As they sifted through James's emails, phone records, and work documents, it became clear that they were up against something far more complicated than they had originally imagined. As the days passed, the investigation into the Hope family massacre deepened, and Detective Markson and Detective Rivera began to feel the weight of the case pressing in on them. At first, they had been certain that Tom Harris, the disgraced former colleague of James Hope, was the key to solving the mystery, but the more they looked into Tom, the more they realized that things weren't as straightforward as they seemed. The breakthrough came when the detectives discovered a hidden folder on James's laptop. It had taken weeks for the tech experts to crack the encryption, but once they did, they found a series of strange messages that James had received over the past few months. These weren't simple emails or work-related correspondences. They were cryptic anonymous messages, and they painted a much darker picture than anyone had imagined. The messages were addressed to someone named X, and the contents were unsettling. James had been involved in something far more dangerous than just a corporate dispute. The conversations were full of veiled threats with mentions of financial schemes, secret meetings, and of a plan that James had been part of. It was clear that James had been under pressure for months, possibly even longer, and the tone of the messages suggested that he was caught in something he couldn't escape from. As the detectives carefully read through the messages, they realized that they were far more than just a series of work-related disputes. There were references to a deal gone wrong, talks of keeping things quiet, and ominous hints that James had been forced to take part in something illegal, something that could have ruined him if it were ever exposed. But what could it be? And why had James been involved in such a dangerous situation? The detectives shifted their focus now, considering the possibility that James's involvement in a larger conspiracy was the real motive behind the killings. The question no longer seemed to be about revenge from Tom Harris. It was about who or what James had gotten mixed up with. The murder of the Hope family began to feel less like a personal attack and more like a warning, one that was meant to silence not just James, but everyone who might have known about the secrets he had been keeping. But there was one more shock in store for the detectives. The deeper they dug into James's private life, the more they uncovered about Catalina Hope. As it turned out, she had been more than just a passive bystander in her husband's life. In fact, Catalina had been in contact with Zas well. She had been receiving similar cryptic messages from the same mysterious sender, and it became clear that she was involved in whatever scheme James had been part of. The detectives were stunned. Catalina, the devoted wife, had been hiding something all along. But what was her role in this? Was she a willing accomplice, or had she been coerced into keeping her husband's secrets? The idea that Catalina had been involved in a conspiracy alongside James and had kept it hidden from everyone, including their children, was a reaction that shook the entire investigation. Toitscore, the more they pieced together, the more it seemed that the Hopes had been leading double lives. They had been part of something much bigger, something that had eventually spiraled out of control. The massacre on Christmas Eve wasn't the work of an angry ex-colleague. It was the final act of a web of deceit, blackmail, and illegal dealings that had consumed the entire family, and now the detectives had to figure out how deep the conspiracy went and who else might be involved. As the investigation took yet another unexpected turn, Markson and Rivera knew they were close to uncovering the full extent of the truth, but with every new discovery they realized the case was far more complex and dangerous than they had ever imagined. The Hope family's perfect life had been a lie, and the massacre was just the beginning of a much darker story. As the investigation into the Hope family massacre unfolded, Detective Markson and Detective Rivera found themselves piecing together a puzzle with more pieces than they had initially expected. With every new detail they uncovered about James and Catalina's involvement in a mysterious financial conspiracy, the path ahead grew murkier. But the detectives were getting closer, and with each new lead they began to sense they were nearing the heart of a dangerous web that was far-reaching and more sinister than anyone had anticipated. The breakthrough came when the detective traced the mysterious ex who had been contacting both James and Catalina. Using the encrypted communications and a series of IP addresses, they were able to track the messages to an offshore account, one that led them to an Amy they had never heard before. Victor Harrow. Harrow was a known figure in underground financial circles, rumored to be involved in money laundering, fraud, and high-level financial manipulation. He was the kind of person no one dared cross, and his presence in the investigation opened up an entirely new layer of intrigue. It appeared that James and Catalina Hope had been roped into Harrow's web, possibly without even fully understanding the scope of the operations.